The Saw franchise is easily one of my favorite horror franchises of all time. Whenever there's a new movie, I'm seated there day one. Just a massive fan overall, and Saw X was a huge turning point in this franchise. It felt like for the first time in a while there was some new life breathed back into it. It was nice to actually be on the side of everybody else when it came to this, because for a long time you got the general snarky remarks, oh, did we need a new Saw movie? Most of them were not well received. I understand why they weren't, but I still really enjoyed a lot of the later Saw movies, and it just felt like generally the discourse, the discussion surrounding every new Saw movie was just a collective groan from most people saying, we don't need this, we don't need another one, nobody cares anymore, this franchise is way past its prime. Although I'd always disagree, it was kind of hard to argue when the general consensus was that these movies were starting to not be very good. They were not making as much money. Although I was always on board, although I still liked the movies, it was hard to argue that everybody else collectively wasn't. So when Saw X came out, highly praised, probably even the most praised entry in the franchise, which is insane because of the 10th one, and it just cracked the code on how to make one of these movies. It felt obvious that for a franchise that's been running as long as this one, that they were going to take that and continue, run with that storyline, especially when you have so many dangling plot threads like the doctor who still deserves her comeuppance for what she did to John. It just felt natural that, they would be extending, and they even had initially planned a 1-year quick turnaround, just get that newest movie out as quickly as possible. And then, what I think was the right decision was they decided ultimately, no, let's push it back another year. Let's give it time to cook. Let's make sure that it's right. Let's not microwave the script and just wind up pissing off all the fans all over again and showing that Saw X was just a fluke. They want to get the story right, and I really respected that, and I was fine with waiting that extra year if it meant that Saw 11 was going to be just as great as Saw 10. The problem is now that we're starting to hear some troubling news, which is really disappointing to hear because I'm still really looking forward to Saw 11. Though it's still announced, it's still looking like it will hopefully happen. There's been talks of delays, there's been talks of, issues behind the scenes, and some of it might have to do with the rights behind the characters and the property as a whole. This is actually something that 3C talked about, and this kind of stems from his tinfoil hat. It's looking like there isn't necessarily creative differences in terms of what would make a great Saw 11. It's in general what to do with this property at this point. Apparently Blumhouse has, invested a good amount in Lionsgate. They want to reboot, refinance some franchises and refurnish them, and some of the backers behind the Saw franchise and Lionsgate in general might potentially be looking to reboot, take the Blumhouse money instead of going with Saw 11, and that would just be so devastating and disappointing to me, I think. Although I agree, there's going to be a point where Tobin Bell can't do this anymore. He's definitely getting up there in age. He can't do this forever. I think he's probably got 1 or 2 more movies in him. And I would think that, after they conclude this prequel trilogy of Saw X, once they tie up all these storylines, make sure that the franchise is in a good place, the fans are happy with that closure, then I think is the right time to reboot. Otherwise, you're just going to divide the fandom and end up with a Scream 7 situation where nobody is happy. The thing I really don't get with these executives is they really are their own worst enemies. They could avoid so many issues if they just listened to the fans, and if they wanted to go in a different direction, tie things up, make sure that the fans are satisfied first before taking a new direction. I would say that, kind of like the Zack Snyder's Justice League situation, they could have avoided a lot of heartbreak by just staying the course, even if they wanted to conclude it more soon. Just make sure that the fans had that closure so that they were ready to go with a reboot of the franchise or just a different direction if they wanted to continue with the DCEU. But instead, they cut things off, pissed off the fans, made nobody happy, and now the fandom is more divided than ever. Same thing with Scream 7. When they made that really stupid decision to fire Melissa Barrera, they ended up alienating a significant amount of their fans, and now the hype behind Scream 7 feels like it has this looming cloud over it where a lot of fans are unhappy that they're not continuing with the core 4 storyline. So now you have kind of a new fans, old fans division. There's not a cohesive fan base at this point, and I think that something similar would happen with Saw if they were to cut things off right now, just when we had a great entry, just when we were about to have very interesting conclusion to Tobin Bell's Jigsaw, not getting that closure with his version of the character, and having those sequels taken right out from under our noses. Feels like just generally a horrible idea that would take away a lot of goodwill with the fans. And a lot of people will be left questioning, hey, why didn't we just get Saw 11? Why are we getting this reboot or remake with a new actor and whole new universe? It just makes no sense to me. I think that it would be a bad idea for both Lionsgate and Blumhouse to do, because you're going to have to deal with, how do we convince these fans to come back? This also would just further the idea that Saw fans will never be rewarded for their investment in the franchise. Because even when the movies are good, they're still going to cut them off, apparently. Since the final chapter, every new attempt has been basically a one-off attempt to jumpstart the franchise back up. Jigsaw was an attempt to revitalize the franchise, maybe continue with The Doctor Apprentice. That wasn't received as well despite, doing well at the box office. So that was cut off, kicked to the curb. Next, we did Spiral from the Book of Saw, Chris Rock's attempt at the Saw franchise, which I remember 2021, was intended to jumpstart potentially a new trilogy with new sequels. Would have been Chris Rock's character versus the Apprentice in that movie, probably sprawling throughout more Saw traps, more of this kind of cop edge to it, this police corruption angle to this Jigsaw killer's motivation. And now we had Saw X. We have an unambiguous winner. Everybody was happy with it. The fans loved it, made a lot more money than Spiral, and they really cracked the code on how to utilize this main character of Jigsaw. And the idea that they would take this win and pretty much just sabotage themselves into obscurity by rebooting, cutting things off very short, especially when they actually have a release date and poster for Saw 11. Really bizarre idea that they would even consider this. I just don't think there's any winners. I think down the line, definitely, that might be the way to go. I would actually agree that it 100% is the way to go. As much as I love the Saw movies and I love how this lore kind of unfolds, how there's all these reveals, how there's so much backstory, and despite how convoluted it can be, I really enjoy it. But I think that it is getting to a point where things are getting bogged down. Tobin Bell's getting too old. It's going to need to wrap it up soon, and I think a clean slate would be a good idea in maybe 5 years. Once they make maybe Saw 11 or 12, once they wrap up what's going on with Jigsaw, maybe tie a few loose ends with some of the apprentices that are still out there, I'm all game for it. I'm fine with a Saw reboot at the appropriate time. But doing it right now, doing it out of greed, doing it because you want Blumhouse money, and not thinking about the fans, it's just a horrible idea and just not really the smartest way to think about this from even a business standpoint. If they continue with the momentum of what Saw X did, they're going to make more money with Saw 11. That's just generally what happens even after a franchise has been essentially burned or run into the ground. If you have some goodwill and momentum built up by the fans, they will come back for the next movie. It makes me think of, what happened with Batman Begins. After only 7 or 8 years after Batman and Robin, Batman's reputation was in the toilet. And Batman Begins didn't do great at the box office, but it was received incredibly well. They kept the budget down just enough, and because you had this visionary director behind it and everybody loved it, got on board, and became Batman fans once again. When they came back with The Dark Knight, the movie made over $1 billion and like 3 times as much as Batman Begins made. It also helps that The Dark Knight was in and of itself just one of the best comic book movies ever made, but you get the point. Building back that goodwill with the fans really matters. Definitely is not something that's negligible. I think that what franchises need to start to do is keep into consideration their fans, because I think that the death of a lot of them and a lot of the perceptions of these franchises come from one franchise devastating move that basically splits everyone in half. For that reason, DC is in shambles. For that reason, Star Wars is in shambles, and I think that Scream 7 might learn a hard lesson because of this segregation of the fandom. Splitting your fans is the worst possible thing that you could do when you're managing an IP, and the decision of cutting off the Saw franchise prematurely so that you could reboot it with new actors and a new slate, that feels like a horrible idea to me. I think too that people will be much more willing to come around to it, much more willing to accept it if that time was right and they had that closure. Most of it is just providing that closure for the fans so that they're more willing and open to accept the new stuff that's, to come. But those are just my thoughts on this situation, what could potentially be going on with Saw 11 and its potential cancellation, which God forbid I hope is not true. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section. I'd love to hear. I'm GM Light. Have a good one.